We have a little bit of language about, so that is another spec in for person about dealing with IRI. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I really appreciate you taking a look at it. Yeah. So I am aware that IRI is shifting this, and so that's flagged at least in. More consistency. That's good. You can stack, right? He's got a split. Okay, perfect. Good. That's good. So there's only one. There is one that has the different mixabilities. So there's an example of. Oh yeah. Yeah. Okay, so there's that. Right. Yeah, that's the nesting thing we were talking about. Yeah. Yeah. So that was pointed out on the list. We knew that we needed to fix that. So. Well, it's just explorer, right? Yeah. Yeah. That's what I understand. Yeah,
we're going to start in a couple of minutes if we can start settling in.
I mean, should we do start a thread about this, or just email thread or something, or I mean, again, I just want to make sure we capture what concerns CCR. Yeah. Hello, people listening to me. I am not sharing anything you should not hear. So yeah, that will help us out with this. So Krishna is mostly doing the passport spec, not mostly doing the 4474 this spec. Some of the specific is actually doing that questions. But appreciate your. Yeah. Yeah. No, we need it because I personally am not qualified to operate that machine, so like it is good to yeah. Yeah, it's done.
Let's go ahead and get this done. The blue sheets have been around the room a couple of times already. Who still needs one?
I'll pull the door.
All right, welcome to the STIR working group meeting at IETF 96. We are operating under the note well for this meeting. If you're not familiar with the note well, you need to take a moment now to familiarize yourself with it. Look for the links that came in your registration material. We have an agenda that I suspect we're going to run ahead of. I don't think we're going to end up using some chunks of this time. But here's a moment for agenda bashing. Anybody have a bash they want to bring? Hearing none of that, John, if you can work your way up, I'll bring up the 4474 BIS slides.
Monitor, where you see this, or am I going to be kind of talking at the wall? I think I'm talking at the wall. So hi, I'm John. Welcome to RC 4474 BIS. This is an exciting time. Next slide. Exciting time being there is a working group last call in progress, not merely for this specification, but as well for the passport spec and the STIR certs spec. This is the primary work we set out to do here, people, and it looks like we're getting down to the wire on it, which is great. And one of the great things about it is we've gotten a lot of new eyes on it recently. A lot of new comments, some adult supervision that we probably desperately required when we were experimenting with things that we, at least I personally, am not qualified to operate, and we'll get into that a bit as we go through the day. Yeah, fair enough. But yeah, this is the time to look at it. So when I have the going, gone at the top, please do take a look at it now so we don't end up shipping something in which we've made some trivial errors. So there's been some list discussion about this and some private correspondence since the working group last call started. I want to go over what a couple of those things were and see if we can get some resolution for them here today. Obviously, we will be confirming all of that on the list as we go forward. But why don't we start with the beginning?
Ready?
Yeah, so, you know, back when we did 4474 originally, we started to include a number of new status codes that were specific to the use of the identity header. And these were things like bad identity header, right? Things that we hoped would be repairable error conditions, that someone would be able to see them and say, okay, I understand what I need to do to respond to this and resend the request appropriately. We have a lot of text in there actually that talks about the validity of the date header in particular. As some of you may recall, we do provide a cryptographic signature over the contents of the date header field, although thanks to the passport changes, that has now been recast into the IET parameter that appears in the claims section of the passport object. But you know, we never really defined an error code that means the date that you provided has a good signature over it, there's no problem with that, but the date's actually stale. And this is important for cut and paste attacks. We want this message to really only, the cryptographic assurance to only really apply for the time scale that we expect call setup might require. Remember, our threat model here is preventing, in particular, impersonation attacks. And these would be things for robocalling, where you want to be able to impersonate a random number or a very specific number in some cases, voicemail hacking, swatting, all kinds of threats like that. And as a consequence, we certainly don't want to be able to create one of these passport objects and just have someone be able to reuse it way later. So we have language in the spec that has said from the very start that if the data is stale, that's a problem, but we never said what you should do. And this was recently pointed out. So we have two, I guess, basic options. We could define a new status code or not. We could try to reuse some existing status code. We could take something very generic like the 400 bad request, maybe even a 500 grouping error condition, and just give it a good reason phrase that makes it clear that the problem is the data is stale. Or programmatically, probably if we think this is a repairable condition, we could instead define a new error code for it. I don't think there's much reason not to define a new error code. I think that's my vague preference, but let's talk about it. If people have views about whether it's better to kind of reuse some existing status code and just give it a different reason phrase, or if we should define a new one, be happy to hear views.
So and this isn't repairable, right? This is just like, we're sorry, you're screwed, right?
Well, I mean, it's repairable in the sense that if the request, so let's imagine that just something like really stupid happened, right? And for some reason it took a long time for this request to be delivered. I can't imagine what that would be necessarily, but I mean, at least it's informing the, original authentication service that the reason why this is being failed is explicitly because the date header was stale, or maybe it's misconfigured, right? So maybe an authentication service is not on NTP and is omitting dates that are just completely misaligned with what dates actually are. And so it might be able to look at that, and for debugging purposes, you'd be able to.
Right. I mean, I guess I go back to first principles here, which is to say that you should have a numeric error code if you think the other guy's gonna do something about it in some meaningful way, other than just putting it out to the engineer. And if it's just going to be like a complaint, then 400 the new reason phrase seems like an appropriate thing to do. So I think that's where I cut the line.
Yeah.
Alan Ford, I actually agree with that. I think given all the scenarios you listed, none of them are ones that could happen in a sane environment that wouldn't require human intervention to go and fix, and human intervention to fix means reading a human readable response code. So I think reason header. So I think that's probably the best move.
Okay.
Please state your name for those.
He did. Alan Ford. I did it to start.
Sorry, I missed it.
Okay, I mean, again, I have no strong feeling about this either way. So if people would like to just see us use a 400 or something like that for this, with the new reason phrase, just as stale date. Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah, we could do a 403 for that. Again, we can talk about which exact one we want to reuse. That's a separate discussion. But yes, Mr. Dolly.
Martin Dolly, AT&T. I prefer a new error code because if there's one thing that has been screwed up here with respect to interoperability is the reuse of error codes over and over again to the point that they are meaningless.
That's fair. I mean, I think I can see an argument for something maybe that's not as generic as bad request, but like Dr. Hardy suggested, doing it with something like forbidden, or at least it's clear that what the semantics are is that this has been rejected for a security reason, and then you have an appropriate reason phrase that's attached to that. Martin, can you be sold on something roughly like that, at least? You can shake your head or nod.
A reason phrase would be good, yes.
Okay, so a reason phrase with something like 403 you think would work?
As long as we standardize the reason phrase.
We would. So this would say, you know, 403 and it's, you know, stale date header or something. If no one feels that that's a terrible idea, what I propose we do is we put that into the next version of the specification. Works for me. I mean, again, this is really a syntax question more than anything else, right? So, okay, let it be noted that we're going to do that for 11. Next slide. All right, this is probably our most substantive conversation today. I'm glad, Krister, you were able to be here for this particular slide, since Krister has been talking about this in the list. But I don't just want to talk about Krister's issue, but also I think a more fundamental thing that Chris and I have been talking about now for some time. And let me go back into history a little bit to explain how we ended up at the crossroads that we have today with this. So today, the identity header has an optional parameter that is called canon. And originally, back before we moved to JWS as the format for the signature, we invented canon as like an optimization that could be used to carry the results of the telephone number canonicalization procedures that had been enacted in order to generate the telephone number that the signature happened over. And we needed to share the canon optionally, basically as like a debugging or optimization measure so that the authentication service could communicate to the verification service exactly what the results of its canonicalization procedure had been. And the verification service, when it ran the canonicalization procedure, could then just compare it to that, right, without doing the signature operation, and would have a pretty good idea whether or not it was even worth the time of doing the cryptographic operation of actually verifying the signature. And this is something we talked about. Again, Martin, I think you were one of the people who advocated pretty strongly for doing this at the time. But when we moved to JWS, of course, everything changed, because now we were going to be generating, instead of the previous pipe separated string that we would just generate and discard, we would instead be generating a JWS object, which we would largely discard at the end and merely keep the signature and stuff that signature into the identity header. But for the same purpose that original optimization was included, to make sure that the verification service performed the calculation the same way that the authentication service did, we thought, okay, we should optionally have a way to carry the header and claims of the JWS object that could appear in the identity header. And it seemed to do the same thing. So that's how we ended up with what we have. And many people have pointed out that we don't have a lot of like motivational text in there for this. And if you're not familiar with that history, as an implementer, this could potentially be confusing for you. I'm sympathetic to that. I've heard that a couple times now. We will at least be doing something about that in the next version of the specification. But there are kind of a couple paths that we could take to remedy what I think the concerns have been raised about canon. You know, Chris has argued, and Chris, you're welcome to get up to the mic and state it your way if I don't get it quite right. Because we imagine that there are a lot of conditions where sending canon will be necessary to do the verification on their side. And the most prominent one is we're well aware that there are a number of networks out there that alter the date header of SIP requests in transit. This is one of these things that, again, I'd like to say that if you do that, you're bad and you should feel bad. It's really difficult to understand why intermediaries do this. There are a couple, again, a lot of it is just tiny syntactical changes, but as they make those syntactical changes, it will drift enough that the IITs will not be the same. I mean, you can think about this really as being largely symptomatic of the fact that B2B UAs out there in the world are terminating one request and re-originating a different one. And when they do that, they will probably stick a date on it that, you know, may therefore be a second or maybe two off from what the original date was in the invite, as was created by the UAC in the first place. So because of that, if we imagine that condition is going to be very common in all meaningful networks, then it makes a lot of sense to send canon all the time. And if you're sending canon all the time, effectively, we shouldn't even have canon, right? It shouldn't even, if it's not gonna be optional, we shouldn't split this into these two chunks anymore. We should just carry the entire JWS object in the identity header. So that's one question that's on the table. But Krister pointed out that RC 7515 has this kind of a vague piece of text at the end of it. It's called Appendix F. And that Appendix F suggests actually in baseline JWS, if you're so inclined, you can exclude the payload and merely have the signature and the headers. Now, there's a reason why you have to have the headers in JWS, and this comes down to, I guess, the fact that the algorithm parameter in particular is mandatory. And for all the use cases that JWS envisioned when they wrote 7515, you would need to have the header there for at least that purpose, and probably to manage a few other things as well. So really the only reason why we wanted to do canon as optimization in the first place was to prevent yourself from carrying redundant bytes. All you're saving by having canon in there as an optional parameter is, and we've sized this a few different ways. Is it 30? You know, depending on what extensions might be used, it could be larger. It's a certain amount of bytes, and it matters in the overall size of SIP messages. And if we're looking at mobile environments where people are really persnickety about saving like as many bits as they can, there seemed to be some justification for doing this. At this point, we have, you know, I think we've gone around this poll a couple times. So what's in the baseline spec now is that canon is optional. You can send it. It is not on by default, but we imagine that there could be deployments that, as a profile for that deployment, would require canon to be there. And we've suggested doing that potentially for environments where we know ahead of time there's a lot of modification of the date header, for example, or other similar conditions like really weird munging of the telephone numbers that are included that would make local policies impossible to recover at the verification service that were anticipated by the authentication service. So I've just given a lot of background to this conversation, and I'm certainly welcome to have, if anyone has questions kind of about why we got to this and how we got to this, I'm happy to talk about it. But I think the main questions that we have here are, first of all, you know, the way I think about it, we're not even really carrying a JWS object in SIP, right? We're carrying a set of data that can be used by the verification service to construct a JWS object. Because of that, I don't think about this like it's a JWS like compliance issue. Like I'm not even looking at like, do I need to be compliant with 7515? I just want to make sure that a verification service can build that object at such a time as it receives the SIP request. That's the philosophy that informed the way we use canon today, and I'm interested if people think that is acceptable. The other paths would be including the entire JWS object every time and saying that we don't really care about that byte optimization. That's a reasonable, sane way to approach this. It makes architecture simpler. To be clear though, at this point, that's a fairly intrusive change to the spec. It's not that big a change to implementation, frankly, but it's a big change to the spec. And it'll cost us another cycle to do that. And I would characterize this at least as another kind of late surprise, because it's got to be ripped out from a ton of different places. We're going to have to rewrite a ton of the spec, and I'm sure I'll mess some things up as we do it. We're going to have to have more eyes on it, and we're just going to lose another cycle if we do this. We also should consider Krister's suggestion of doing this with the Appendix F method, though we have some people here that know a bit about JWS to help inform us about that. So I've talked enough. Please, Mike's talk.
Chris went. Yeah, I think you encapsulated our discussions pretty well. I mean, part of this is, you know, just purely maybe considering getting this into the network and making sure, you know, we don't have 2 round trips of the invite because, you know, there's some weird thing. Now, you could argue people should be fixing that, and that really shouldn't be an issue. But maybe it's a little bit of paranoia there that maybe to start, we should just have the full JWT. I think there's other arguments, maybe, at scale is the reconstructing of the header and claims, CPU impact or anything like that. I don't know, that may or may not be a good argument.
The problem is you
but-
always have to do that work, right? You always have to do the work of finding every field and set and extracting it and comparing it to everything that's in JDOS. So
Right.
I don't think there's any
it
actual
could be-
savings in the
right.
computation. This
Yeah.
is just about the bits on the wire. It's really just about, do we want to save those
Yeah, it might
30
be
to
trivial.
60 bytes?
It's
Right?
a string compare versus a string manipulation thing, but I think that's the major thing. I mean, maybe once this, if we do see, if the number of bits on the wire in aggregate does make an impact, then I think some of those things will have to be determined once we start putting this on the network and really seeing the overall impact, I guess is my point.
I mean,
I'm fine with having the option right now, and I'm fine, like for example, in a profile document, we say to start, it's Canon every time. We always have that option. So.
And my concern, ultimately is even if the bare minimum isn't that much, we know people are going to be putting extensions into this for various environments. We know we've heard a lot of talk about gets and things like that, and there can be other fields going to be added on top of this. And so these objects could start to get substantial because of that.
Yep. So as long as we're flexible, I'm fine, but I sort of tend to think that just from making sure it works and we're not doing any, not having a lot of 400 errors coming back, Canon might be the safer route.
Chris and everybody else on that mic is not particularly sensitive. Go ahead and choke up on it pretty hard.
Yeah. You
Eric
say
was
so. I guess 2 points.
I said he's Eric.
I'm not sure, actually. That's the whole point of this working group, isn't it? I guess if you think we're going to eventually end up carrying Canon around all the time, like we should just suck it up and do it now. Second point, arguably the by construction mechanism is slightly easier not to screw up from a security perspective than the checking mechanism, because you have to actually, you can't omit the checks or it won't work at all. Whereas if you have to do the comparisons, then it's very easy not to compare correctly. I guess one question I've that perhaps is I should ask at a different time is if you are carrying Canon, can you go the other? Could you instead of checking, could you simply stop? That is, say, ignore the value in the SIP header and take the value out of Canon and shove it in there, right? That would be a safer mechanism. So I don't maybe for good reasons why you can't do that, but that's what I mentioned in case anybody thought of it.
Provided that the end result of however we order those comparison operations is that we get the reference integrity, right, with the necessary fields to ensure that this is not a cut and paste attack. Yeah, we can talk about a bunch of different strategies for doing that.
Right. I guess the final thing I would say is that I am not worried about the apparent non-conformance issue to JWT or JWS. Let me suggest a way of reasoning about this that may make people happier. This is a form of co-compressing the JWS and the message, the very custom compression mechanism. And we start out by taking the JWS and the message, we compress all the redundancy out in a specific way, and then we reconstruct at the end and we verify.
Yeah. I mean, that's vaguely the argument I'm making there on the first bullet. Yeah.
So, Matt Miller.
Van Jacobson.
Yeah.
Matt Miller. So, kind of like you've gone over. I mean, so, the compliance thing here is really just at the point that you want to shove it through an existing JWS implementation, it needs to contain these things.
Yeah.
How you get there, frankly, who gives a fuck, right? I mean, it's as long as it gets there.
Definitely.
Now, that said, there are some concerns when it comes to JSON and its lack of a defined canonicalization globally, that there's extra concerns that could end up, especially if you've got to sort strings in certain ways. And you got to make sure those strings are represented exactly the right way. And JSON lets you do fun things like substitute strings for surrogate pairs if you're not careful.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that, I think, during Chris's passport presentation. Yeah.
So, but I mean, the important thing is, I mean, Appendix F certainly allows you to remove the payload from what you send over the wire, as long as what goes into the processor all matches up.
Yeah.
The header, that's a little bit harder to remove. If it had just one field, it's, you know, whatever. Since it's got, I think the current spec I was glancing through, it's got 3. It gets a little trickier to put it through an existing implementation. So you're probably going to want to carry that header ... sig.
Yeah, and I mean, looking again from a pure specsmanship and what we standardize where perspective, I mean, from my reading at least of Appendix F, we would really need to flesh that out, right? I mean, it's a paragraph of effectively non-normative text that speculates that you could use. It doesn't even have an example that shows like, you know, foo ... sig, right? I mean,
Right.
So I feel like there's more work to be done on
Sure.
JWS before we can even claim that that is an option that
Sure, there's
is
certain
interoperable.
things that'll be a little bit easier than others, and especially if the assumption here isn't so much compliance with 7515, but reusing what it already is out there, right?
Yeah.
There are a certain number, there are actually more every day of these Jose implementations. If you want to use those straight up, there are some of these concerns. One of these is validation-wise, most of them will take the header as it gets it. Trying to reconstruct that, you're asking for a lot of trouble.
Chris went, but some of those existing implementations sort of assume JWT as a type and some other things. So I think you're customizing things anyway.
So, okay, Matt Miller again. So there are Jose implementations, and then there are Jose plus JWT implementations. They're not quite the same thing. And it is entirely possible to use a Jose implementation to do JWT work. You could use a JWT implementation. You'd be taking on that extra layer of whatever JWT requires of you. Or you could say, you know what, as long as thank you, as long as you're doing the right, I mean, as long as you're still, as long as you're still matching up what you need to match up, and just using Jose as the format, and it happens to also look, it happens to look enough like a JWT that it uses a JWT, but implementation-wise, you might want to consider something else. As long as it all works, right? I mean,
Yeah. I mean, certainly we went back and forth so much about JWT versus doing this as JWS baseline that we're going to build on that. I mean, this is like perennial flip-flopping for us.
I mean, as long as everybody's agreed on how it all works, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel again, then, great.
Right. So, I mean, from the purely selfish perspective of, again, getting this done as expediently as we can, and not me personally not having to do the work of finding every instance of canon in the specification and extirpating it and replacing it with something that would be more like Appendix F after we fix Appendix F to get it in the form that would be needed to do this. I think what we have is good enough to throw it out there with, I think, the clear intention that if what we discover is in these deployment environments it is necessary to send canon all the time, that will be the profile for those environments, and B, that we will actually then revisit the standard and recast it in a way that gets that right. And I think that's that's what I think from getting something out there that is going to work. Because this is really, it's a pretty narrow syntactic change. None of us are arguing for different semantics. We all want the same thing. When we will carry the object, we want to be able to eliminate as much redundancy in the bits that are carried as possible. It's just a question about what the syntax of it is and what the best way that we can honor the spirit of JWS as we do it. So roughly, I think what we've got right now is okay.
So that is what I'm hearing is the proposal. Krister, you had the strongest argument against it. Now that you've heard this conversation, are you comfortable with keeping what we currently have?
Yeah, I'm fine with that. With the assumption, we had some offline discussions, and there are a lot of things which you talk about the example here, but it was also more how to generate this canon parameter. But offline, I've been told that that's going to be done. But I'm okay with this. This principle.
So the fundamental basis for your concern you feel has been addressed.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, as this previous speaker said, as long as it works.
Okay.
Well, and the last two bullets there are really intended to get to what you're speaking to. We will have some motivational text, and we will have at least one solid example that actually shows how you do canon and where the dots are when you get to them.
This is Rich Shockey. You did say the word example. Is that correct?
I did say example.
Excellent.
Can you jokingly flip forward 2 slides for me, please? 3 slides, that one. You can do that. You can do that. Thank you. Okay, so I think we're good on this. Anybody else on this? Because again, this is last call, and we'd really like the version after this to be stable and to be what we can say with a straight face to the many regulators and other people that are very interested in us getting this done expediently, that we think we can go forward with it.
We're checking again, but to the point that is made in this entire discussion, clearly, and I think Chris would agree with me, as we work through this at this particular point in time, we can do this in a variety of profile documents on an implementation basis where other entities, industry groupings can say, well, I know the specification says this, but you need to put a canon in there all the time, no matter what, because we say so. And this is flexibility. The specification allows for flexibility. If the function of profiles is to tighten things up based on operational experience, so I'm good to go with this as well.
Thank you, Richard.
Ready?
Yep. There are a couple of other things, again, that just kind of come in as last call comments, and I just wanted to make sure that we aired them, that we discussed them, and that that we're all on the same page about that. And Martin, you may be interested in this one, because again, this was one of your issues. What it says today in 4474 bis 12 or 10, and it said for the past couple revisions, is that the originating telephone number or originating URI can be extracted from either the from header field value or the PAI header field value. And one implementer commented, though, that it might be better to make that explicit. In other words, to add a PPT value, which is the extensibility mechanism that we've defined for Passport, that says, provides an additional claim, and that additional claim is a signature over PAI. And the argument for this is just, to be explicit about it, so that there can be no ambiguity at the verification service of what the field was that you took this from. And I understand that well, and all I can really say is why we didn't do that in the first place. And I think the reason why we didn't do that in the first place still pertains for me. So let me walk through again why we did that. Our motto was that any environment where you send PAI knows to use PIR already. And that 4474 bis reflects that. And this is an argument made where, PI would never have worked, right? We're merely taking the fact that if you are existing in a deployment environment where you use PAI, to get your from stuff from the PAI instead of from the from header field. And the presence of PAI is the indication of the message that signals that you do that, right? And that accordingly, no environment that actually uses this could be confused about it. This was our proposition, at least, that led us down the path that we're in.
Okay, Martin Dolly. Okay, Martin Dolly. The issue here is that with PAI, in the environment to which you speak, if PAI truly was trusted and not tainted, then we could just use PAI to identify that this is a valid number being used by that subscriber. The problem is that is not true. The problem is today, for instance, enterprises will send the PAI that's not verified by the carrier, to the network at this current point in time. The carrier only cares about processing based on the subscription ID associated with that enterprise. And so therefore, there's no screening of what is put in that PAI. Plus, PAIs do also come from other untrusted environments. So, I mean, just like with the SS7 doohickey, the whole chain of trust, as we know, is not there in the managed networks. There's chinks in the armor. And so PAI is definitely, to know that it's a PAI signed, I think would be very helpful.
Yeah, so this is the argument for why we we do this at all. Like when I first thought about it, when you're first saying this, Martin, I'm like, Martin is like totally off this rocker. I mean, who would use PII and identity at the same time, right? Because the whole point of having PII is that you're in some trusted environment. But I think Martin was able to persuade me with roughly that argument. In fact, there is some value in signing it because then you have the accountability to know who it was that generated it cryptographically. And that's not something that PII ordinarily provides. So for all the reasons you described, that's the way we did this. I mean, the issue that this particular implementer raises is slightly different than that, in that this is a question of, should we provide a second, basically probably a copy of the identity header that is there just to sign the PAI, that would be in addition to the one that signs the from. Now, the reason why I'm not too sold on that, and again, I didn't put that on this particular slide, is because the environments where PII is used also tend to be environments where like there's just junk in the from, and that junk has there's no value in signing it whatsoever, right? So because that's the case too, I like better this idea. You just like clobber what would have been the from header field, but with what's in PAI, you sign that and you say you're done. So my proposal is no change, but since this came up and it came from an implementer who, you know, thought that there might be something to this, I wanted to at least make the argument and see if anybody had some strong feelings.
Oh, wait, hold on. Paul's in front of you in the queue. So, Paul, you can go.
Hi. I guess my question about the PAI thing is, you say everybody that uses it knows they're using it and so on. What about, you know, an environment where it doesn't make it end to end, that it uses PAI in a segment of the network and then afterwards it gets passed down farther to somebody else who doesn't?
Yeah, so there is some text about this in 4474 BIS, and this is one of the risks of the approach we took with PAI. There's a privacy risk potentially, because of course the way that 3325, based on the original 3324 model that Mark Watson wrote, right, that the spec-T stuff, you probably remember that, Paul, requires that PIA be removed at trust boundaries. And as a consequence, this introduces a new vulnerability, which is that PII could be removed, but canon, if you included canon, would not. And actually the information then that was signed in PAI could be leaked through canon. And so I mean, there is that potential that you'll end up starting off in an environment with PAI and you will end up terminating an environment where it's not meaningful. And there are a bunch of corner cases around that. What we do now in 4474 BIS is we note that. And we say, okay, yeah, that's an issue. If you're implementing this, be mindful of that. And of course, you could remove canon the way we have canon structured, if that's what you wanted to do at an administrative boundary. We don't require that you do it. But do you think saying that problem's noted is sufficient, Paul?
Well, my concern was more that when it got to the far end wouldn't be able to verify.
Yeah. Yep. No, and again, there are going to be environments where there is a private internal network identifier that is secure, and if it escapes, a verification failure is probably the appropriate behavior. I mean, kind of ask yourself, you know, doesn't that make sense? that is what would happen in this case?
I would argue that it's a direct consequence of transiting that boundary.
Yeah. I mean, a failure in that case, it's, well, you know, we want to avoid unnecessary failures. That actually strikes me as a failure that should probably happen.
I think.
All right, Ola, looks like you're up.
Well, it just strikes me when reading this that remote party ID may have a role there. I know at least one open source implementation from Huntsville, Alabama, they use a lot of our RPID headers instead of PII. So I wonder if we should consider that at all. Or
so we have Krister here. How many P headers did 3GPP register that contained some version of the original calling number that we could have be candidates for this beyond like RPID? I'm guessing it's more than 10. Because there are a variety of billing identifiers, there are a variety of... He's talking about RPID, remote party ID. But I'm just saying, how many P headers alone did we specify? And I mean, this is a consequence of the vast proliferation of identifiers, and some that they're replicating the identifiers that are familiar from SS7 interconnection agreements. And I mean, I would say that is a slippery slope. I'm making a slippery slope argument. I think PAI has, first of all, a status in the IETF process and a deployment profile that justifies us making this exception case for that. I would be really reluctant to look at the 10 or 15 other candidate things that could possibly also fulfill that role. Maybe we could use extensions for that, right? Maybe for RPID, there is actually an extension for that, and we would move to that model for that.
If we ever needed it.
If we needed it, right? So we would just define a PPT that would have RPID as a separate claim that is being signed.
Ole Johansson again. Well, I mean, I can take out a number of phones where I actually have a selection of remote party ID, PII, or from header, those 3 headers, to show as a caller ID on the display. So remote party ID is probably pretty high on this list compared with the rest of the P asserted headers.
Yeah. I mean, we're not going to get too much into UI here, but I don't want to show 15 numbers to somebody when the call comes in either.
Chris, I think the reality is, based on your peering agreements and your own network and the things you do in your network, you're just going to have authentication services and verification services that can adapt to your particular network settings. So
Well, again,
I would stay with no change.
Yeah,
personally.
I think extensions can accommodate that. That's my point, right? I think if there are particular profiles, particular deployment environments that require alternative identifiers for this, I would prefer to address that with extensions. But this one is special, right? And since we entrenched it early on, it's me and Cullen's fault. Where is Cullen? He's hiding somewhere.
Well, you could also enforce from too, but we know that's not going to happen. So
Yeah, fair enough. He's in witness relocation. Okay, so I'm not hearing anybody who is going to bat for something other than no change.
I agree.
Okay, so I won't change it. Diversion, I got this one too, from somebody who asked an interesting question. We all know that basically what the 2-header field signature that we offer in Passport really provides is something that in the S7 world we would probably call the original called number. And as we know, there are a variety of things that can happen in the wacky and wild world of telephony that will cause your call to in fact land at an endpoint with a different telephone number. And the degree to which we want to accommodate this is an open question. Right now, we don't accommodate it at all. There's nothing in the baseline spec that purports to try to solve that in any way. I've thought a little bit about this though, and this is a problem obviously that we have been trying to tackle since the dawn of SIP. I mean, when was the first diversion header proposal circulating? Yeah, late 90s, very, very early on. Obviously, Mary oversaw one of the bigger efforts to try to fix this in a responsible way, which was history info. Though it too had to kind of shy away from doing a cryptographic approach to this at the time. I've actually sketched out a conceivable way of doing that if you really wanted it with a PPT extension that would have the interesting property that when you use this particular extension, the signature would come from the terminating entity, the destination entity that was originally specified, rather than from the origination, and would specify what the new called number is after its redirection or diversion. And I can imagine having multiple identity headers, since we now allow multiple identity headers, is something that looks very much like assigned history info resulting from this. I'm not going to go make that now, but what I'm going to say is if anybody really gets a bee in their bonnet to do this, they're welcome to do it. And I think there is a story about how to do it. I don't think this is not something we're going to even remotely try to address at this stage in our process, but we have at least, I think, a not laughable story about how to do that if you want to.
Well, you kind of led to the conclusion that I was going to reinforce, so what he said.
Okay. So again, proposal is we know I wrote back to that person and said I think we could probably do this if you wanted, but we're not going to change anything in baseline 4474 BIS to fix it.
Yes, the only thing that I would add is that I think that's probably the kind of follow-on effort is that some future group could look at. I don't even think we'd do that here.
Yeah, and we've designed the extensibility mechanism in such a way that it does not require us to do every single one of those. So, okay, if there's no other comments on the wonders of diversion. Next up. There really isn't a lot more to be done here. I mean, they sent some great comments to the list twice. Actually, I read your second version and was like trying to diff it with your first version. The diffs were relatively minor. I hope that my response to your first mail hit most of the things that you wanted to hit there. Yeah, one major thing I pull out from that is we don't have a terminology section now. That actually would be something to add. And this I think maybe dovetails with in general what we're hearing that just more kind of motivation, organizational stuff like that would help. I'd be happy to add a terminology section to the start of this, just to make it a little bit more readable for those poor implementers out there in the world. And we will find a way to accommodate Mr. Shockey's request to have some examples. But that's all we're really hearing. And none of this is like show-stopping to me. Again, and provided we're cool about that canon thing. The canon thing was the only thing I was really worried about in terms of, because that would require surgery and then like, stuff I don't really feel like doing. Robert.
So I just have one comment. I'm too lazy to get up to go to the floor, but it's a from the floor comment. If you do, as you are considering what to add for exposition, things like terminology, I would like for you to take a very conservative approach and add only as little as you need.
Yeah, it's a long spec already. This is not a short or simple spec. And this one of the reasons why Richard's calls for examples, again, are I think, important ones, because people do need to just get something to work out to get the big picture and know what they want to do, because there's a lot in there. There's a lot of SIP behavior that is consequent on this. And like I said, all those response codes, all the authentication and verification service behavior has to be relegated into very specific steps. We've got canonicalization stuff. We've got URI normalization. It's not an uncomplicated spec. So yeah, we don't want to add anything more than we need to.
Ole Johansson, just to stir up that last statement, two of my comments was, one, I have a problem seeing this working with SIP outbound, and I believe SIP outbound is kind of important with SIP outbound, because you require a direct TLS connection to the server.
We don't require it. This is one of my responses to your note. We said that it's a should.
Okay. So then we probably need to outline how it would work with SIP outbound.
I think the text there is probably sufficient, but
okay, I'll go through it again.
Yeah.
The other one is back-to-back UAs, which is a pain. And you said, well, let the straw group handle that, but should we really create new problems for other groups?
I would never delegate anything to the straw group.
Okay,
that's clearly an apocryphal.
That was more or less your suggestion.
Story. No, so
but back-to-back UAs, unfortunately, play a too big role in networks, especially service provider networks today. So we probably should mention them, not just avoid them in the document.
So, and this may just be the history of the group. Since the group's been around now for 3 years, the origin of this group was very much in the question of what could we conceivably get past B2B UAs. And, we really stripped the scope of protection down to what we thought would be the bare minimum. The one aspect of that you raised that I think I'm not willing to compromise on, and that we've taken a hum about here before, and we're certainly not going to change at this point, is MKey. In the sense of per pass and just the general political climate in the IETF, I think makes it absolutely essential that we have a means to carry fingerprints for establishing DTLS SRTP, right, all the way through the verification service. And if there's a B2B UA in the middle that is stripping that material, we want that to be a failure.
Ole Johansson, yes, I completely agree with that, but I think we should document that we require B2B UAs to be transparent and.
Oh no. So we're not placing requirements on the B2B UAs in this document. Yeah, okay. We're not.
But the word B2B UA is not mentioned, and I think that will cause issues. We should properly developed.
Yeah, I do think the word
No,
BBUA is.
I will go to the floor again. I disagree with you.
Yeah, Chris Wynn, I disagree as well. I think B2B I mean, you should be validating tokens earlier in the network path coming into your network rather than later, and probably before any B2B We can't guarantee that, but to go down that route is sort of a rat hole that would be hard, at least in these specs. Maybe
Well,
in some profile
yeah.
document, but I'm afraid to attack it in that either.
And not to be too cynical about this, realistically, the kinds of environments where there are B2B UAs that would be unhappy with MKey, again, I think these are not environments where there are user agents that will be able to generate offers that contain fingerprints for GTLS SRTP. I mean, and I've talked to a lot of the service providers in this room about this question, and the reason why they are not concerned about MKey is because there's nothing in their networks that generates MKey. What I think it is our obligation in the IETF, again, to have a story about were there deployment environments, right, where that was something you could generate, how this would work. And our other working group that's meeting on Thursday night, SIPRND, right, is very much about that question and what that might look like. And so STIR is trying not to close that door, but let's have no illusions about the fact that those highly mediated environments simply they are not environments that this was designed to function in insofar as MKey would be used. And they don't use MKey. It's just not even in, A equals fingerprint is not a part of the vocabulary of the devices that are involved with this. So it seems to be a pseudo problem.
All right.
And that's it. Thanks.
Okay, a few updates to Passport to talk about. You can go to the next slide. This is just an overview. I have actually one page per each, so we can just go. So we made, this is probably the biggest change. We made interim decision to change things. In 03, we had D group to sort of facilitate the future ability to have multi-party sessions and include the claim with all the destination identities. I think John made the suggestion, hey, let's sort of clean that up a little bit. And I agreed that we go back. Actually, I think that was my original claim name was Origin. Maybe I had term originally, but go to that as a parent item, and there's only a single Origin and Dest, and then another change we made, sort of unrelated, well, related to a comment on the list, and then I think to address some of the JSON concerns was that, and the lexicographic order concerns, is that we only have, if you do have multiple destination identities, that there's only a single TN and single URI key. And if you have multiple of each, you should put them in an array with brackets. Chris, comment?
Just a question of clarification. If you have multiple URIs, and for example, now when Alice receives one of these invites, Alice is going to receive both the SIP URI of herself and Bob and whatever you have in there. How is the verification going to happen? And especially if you're not sending the claims, I mean, Alice will not know that Bob has received this. So how are you going to be able to create this claim that you're going to use them to calculate to verify the identity?
The destination, the verification service probably should only look to make sure that they're included in that list. To be honest, we haven't explored in SIP how this whole multi-party thing would be handled. I think actually probably the likely use case will not be SIP. It will be more like WebRTC related and maybe XMPP or other things where you actually do invite multiple or have multiple destination participants.
Yeah, but my question was more like that when one of these destinations receive a message, they don't really know anything about these other recipients.
Right.
Alice will see, okay, there's a Bob identity here, but how is Alice going to verify that?
Well, the purpose of destination also was to validate that the invite was being sent to you and not to somebody, and I think that was part of the replay attack mechanism. So really, it isn't necessarily that you're validating that, you know, I'm a participant and then Bob, like Alice is a participant and Bob is a participant. You don't really care about Bob necessarily in the context of this verification. It's not meant to be like, it's only meant to be the original purpose was only really to be a replay attack prevention mechanism, that you're not sending Alice's signature, the signature with Alice to, you know, XYZ, you know, 1,000 other people.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think Alice, I think the verification service recipient would pick if any one of the identities that is in DAST applies to them, then it's valid for them.
This just accommodates the fact that I am going to send this one signature to Alice and Bob, and both should validate it correctly because they're included in that list of destination claims.
Now, that much said, there is not, for example, in the 4474 BIS, a way to say, how do I find Bob? If this is sent to me, Alice, and Alice is what's in 2, right? Like, where does Bob's name live in the SIP request? And the answer to that, you know, again, this may, if we're even going to do this, and I'm still on the fence if like we even need this in this version of this, I'd be happy to say that like future specifications might find a use for having multiple things in DAST, but for our current purposes, there's only going to be one thing. And any future thing that does that is going to have to describe what the associated SIP behavior is. Because this really like mass text, I think like the only thing, practically speaking, I would use something like this for today. But I imagine the semantics would be something like, if any one of those matches what is in the 2-header field, or what any one of those is an identity that is associated with me, then I'm willing to accept that, right? Well, he's asking like, can I verify that this should be to Bob too by something else I see in the request? Because it's not like the 2-header field can have like an array of URIs in it.
I think his question was even simpler.
That's what I thought.
The sender who creates this is going to calculate the identity value based on this whole string. Everything's in there.
Yeah.
So when the receiver gets it, he has to do the same thing. He cannot just pick one of those and then calculate the identity value, or because he's gonna end up getting a different value. So and I think that comes back to one of the previous speakers said that, are you now saying that before we start, in one way or another, we generate these claims, either we get them or we pick them out from elsewhere. But now, if I hear you correctly, when we've done that, before we start calculating the identity, we have to start modifying it. Maybe, you know, remove either Alice or Bob's from there. I hope that's wrong. But
No.
That would break the signature.
Yeah, exactly.
So I would say it doesn't apply to 4474 BIS at the current moment.
I'm just trying to understand what. Stop. I'm just trying to understand what the desired. You know perfectly well what my name is. I'm just trying to figure out what the desired security property is here.
So we had a statement before about this extending to multi-party sessions.
Oh well. Okay.
And we tried to put in a mechanism for that. I think if you have a signaling mechanism that sends only one quote unquote invite out with all the different participants and forks in the network to everybody, and you only have one signature, you know, I could think of a multi-user chat session that, you know, the multi-user chat session is validating people coming into it because they're part of the passport token that created that would be an example here.
Right. That's not a security property. That's a use case. So, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to, you have the stuff that you signed. That's the stuff you actually can trust. Everything else is just crap that came along with it that is untrustworthy. And so I mean, first of all, as you say, there's nowhere in the document you can put this information outside of the trust boundary in the first place. And right. I mean, so I guess it seems to me that this whole notion of trying to create a correspondence between the things that you signed and the things you didn't sign, and somehow evaluate those are consistent, is like fraught with peril, and it'd be far better. And so the extent to which
Well, let me put it a different way. I am asserting my identity to both Alice and Bob at the same time, and they can validate each and make sure that I'm not sending them a replay attack.
yeah, no, I understand that, but there seems to be some desire to validate, to then go inspect like the exterior messaging, the part that is not part of the signature block, and validate that as consistent with this assertion. That's the part that I have a problem with.
So imagine you're doing like MS through email for like a mass text. Yeah, sorry.
Imagine, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so again, imagine it's an email. Imagine we're doing a mass text by like saying, mail to for this, right? And yeah, when you get the actual email, it will list everyone that's in the to header field, right? And so you have the information that's actually in the message that you can compare to what ended up in Passport. And you then would validate it by saying, I compare each one of those addresses. I'm sorry. I think we've got different sized people, and so we're moving up and down. So, I mean, again, it's not insane. It just doesn't have any applicability, I think, to what at least we're trying to do immediately here. It's a future proofing thing to allow this.
I guess I think it's perfectly fine to allow multiple names in here. I'm not arguing at that. I guess what I'm arguing about is the attempt to somehow bind that to the unprotected envelope information. That's the part I'm concerned about. And the email, I think, is a good example, which is that, like, in S-MIME, if you repeatedly tried to take the unprotected crap that was in the headers and correspond it to the stuff that was signed, it was always a debacle.
Yeah, we need to do some history on that. But my point being, I think our choices are, practically speaking, for this, to either say we're going to disallow it, right, or allow it at this point in Passport. Yeah, let's
Right.
allow it, but let's just put some hazard tape on it that says that any using protocol of Passport is going to have to explain how it's going to use these multiple things and like where it's going to draw them from. And it could be that for most cases that's going to turn out to be completely insane.
And there has to be some logic around the authentication service part as well. I mean, if you're going to put 1,000 people in there, then you have better have a good reason for asserting your identity to 1,000 people in a single Passport token. Yeah. So we're good. Any other comments on that? Anything regarding the JSON stuff? I think the brackets fixes the problem we had before, right? Okay.
If there's only one, there's no bracket.
Right. And I'll. That shouldn't be too bad. The
Wait.
second one, I guess this one's sort of major too. Oh.
Russ is saying, I believe what Russ just said is that we want something in the specification that forbids a URI : bracket sipaliceexample.com quote close bracket.
Right.
If there's only
No
one
lists
here,
with one
you don't
element.
get the square. Otherwise, you don't know how to reconstruct it. You either always want it or
We just need to
never
specify
want
it, I think is
or
all.
There's
I'm saying.
only one.
Surely you always want it.
That's the choices. I was asking him which. He
Yes.
says
No fields that have like multiplicities of data types, please. Let's either always have an array or always have a string.
that'd be fine.
Okay.
Sorry, he's got it.
Okay, I will make that change. Always use brackets on
Fine.
destination, or sorry, on TN or URI.
Krister, you look worried. Sorry, we're to hear.
Yep, that's right. So Russ had brought up, and I think we sort of realized this as well, that if you extend Passport, we originally said that you could remove the bare minimum claims and just create your own thing. But that takes away the security properties and other things. So I think we simply removed section 4.3 and 4.4 and the supporting text around that, and just said that any extension to Passport would just simply be the new PPT, using a new PPT value, and would always require to have the bare minimum tokens, and you would add on from there.
That certainly resolves my comment.
Right. I think we would have figured that out anyways. Even for gets, we were sort of thinking you just send the authentication thing, but you still need the security thing. So I think we're good for that. And yeah, as Matt also pointed out, I didn't put the examples in lexical order, so I will fix that as well. And I'll have to recalculate the tokens as well, but no big deal. And that was it. I don't know, was there any other JWT related conversation that we wanted to have? Oh, okay, Sean?
Sean, you have the floor.
All right, let's see if this works. Hey, I think what we discussed on the list was that we were going to require that the JWS be signed with ECDSA. I think that the stir search draft said that the certs have to be generated including the scheme material, but I was looking for a statement that says the MTI to implement this would be in Passport. Is that where it's going to go, or is it going to go someplace else?
Yeah, I believe I already say it has to be ES 256.
Maybe I searched on the wrong string then.
John, yeah. So I mean,
Yes.
Sean, when we present stir certs, I'll share this because stir certs basically says that it is just tracking what's in Passport for this, right?
Yeah, it's in section 3.1.2. I missed it.
No, but again, I think it's okay if stir certs says this is what the must is and it's following what is in Passport. It doesn't matter if that's in two places.
Okay.
He's satisfied, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
We're good, right?
So,
Yep.
Matt Miller. So one thing to point out with the lexicographical ordering with JSON is if you've got anything that you expect to be like truly Unicode beyond the ASCII base, you can get some interesting.
Right.
You might need to put a statement in that this should be the minimum required encoding, because JSON allows you to escape everything.
Right.
Just dumb and will make your comparisons really hard. Nobody should do that, but you know, idiots are everywhere.
Yeah. I think JSON Web Token that we point to does say something about Unicode, but Unicode's not something we really talked about either. So,
yeah, but it also wasn't trying to deal with lexicographically ordering. Well, the JWK thumbprint spec does, but all the keys that we have today are simple ASCII.
Right.
And so it's something worth at least making some note of, because it'll especially come up if you've got anything that gets beyond basic ASCII, and somebody then is going to think that, oh well, this thing exists in UTF-8, so I'm going to put this in as its surrogate pair escaping, which is then just going to mess everybody up.
I guess a general question is, what do we say about Unicode, or do we need it? Or
yeah, I think the only really hard edge on this. So it's just the keys, right, that you care about for lexical ordering.
So anywhere that you're doing the ordering, so this includes, like, if you've got arrays, you've got to determine the order of elements in. You're going to have to deal with this.
So the only thing I worry about in that is, IRIs or something like that. If we have like bare IRIs that are the values of these things. Well, and again, I don't think it's gonna be a common case, but if you look at the URI normalization procedures that I just hacked into 4474 BIS, and this is brand new text, right? Ted will be able to speak to this better than I can. So what should we do, Ted? Please save us.
I'm not going to save you. You can't, it's international.
Oh, no. I think again, so provided that we're okay, so probably I can't imagine that we're going to experience this anywhere other than in some like IDN-ish thing that might be appearing in an IRI, and if there's some ordering ambiguity that could result from that because we have some kind of an array structure, right, that's associated with a particular key. I wouldn't rule out that that's possible. It doesn't seem extremely likely, but it's at least conceivable.
So in the example, Ted Hardy speaking, in the example there, you have sip:/alice@example.com.
Yep.
If example.com is replaced by example.arabic TLD, where there might be Unicode characters and a potentially left to right Unicode marker, you have two choices. One, you can say, these people don't get the benefit of stir. Well, three choices. That's the null choice, right? Don't do that one. You can say, for this purpose, you must treat this according to an encoding, which can either be like the DNS ACE encoding or could be the URI encoding that requires any such thing to have the percent encoded U mechanisms, right? Or you could say, I'm going to allow you to do that, and I'll do string compare here because this is not actually going to get dereferenced. And I'll do Unicode string compare, which, as I believe we were just told, since idiots are everywhere, will get wrong a lot of the time. And you really don't have to be an idiot to get Unicode string compare wrong.
Right.
It's pretty darn easy to get wrong. So I don't think that you're going to be able to punt this as long as one of the things you have to have in that ordered set includes domain names.
Right. And domain names support Unicode, but is there
Miller, they
don't.
don't, and so A labels are not, right?
Yeah.
U labels are
Right.
Ted Hardy again. The presentation form of DNS labels includes Unicode. If you believe that these will be populated by somebody entering it into a form, they will use the presentation form. Now, you then have to require whoever translates from the presentation form to a wire format to pick between two potential ASCII encodings, one of which is the percent encoded mechanisms associated with URIs, and since this is got URI at the beginning of it, I suggest you use that one. But the other possibility is that somebody might put in the DNS ACE encoding, which is the A label that he was referring to.
Right.
Is that the new name of Unicode?
But URI, I forget the RFC. Does that already address this, or?
Well, yeah. So I think Ted is offering us two choices.
Yeah.
And it would be really helpful, Ted, if you could just send the tiniest little mail to the list to say what you think we should do on this.
No.
Ted Hardy, can I ask, is there anybody in the room that would be seriously hurt if we just suggested using percent encoded for the values which are not in ASCII here? Is that a problem for anybody in the room? We'll confirm it on the list.
Absolutely.
But if I'm going to construct an answer here, I'd like to know if there's already an objection to that answer. Okay, so it sounds like I will try and work with John to craft some text for you.
Okay.
That will be based on treating these URIs using percent encoding if you should encounter a character in UTF-8 which is not in the ASCII range.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Don't get too comfortable, John. It is currently 3:15. We have 45 minutes left. I don't think we'll end up using all of it.
We are not going to use 45 minutes to talk about stir certs. We're going to use like 10 minutes. So we're going to get a little bit of time back, which is good. Next slide. So Sean Turner, who can talk to us in his Pac-Man incarnation here, if you would like. He was very industrious, actually, in the past couple of weeks and released...
One conversation, please.
Yeah, jeez. And actually released a number of new versions of this specification, which is good because there was a lot of cleanup to be done. I don't think there's a lot of it that we're going to need to go over in a ton of detail today. There are a couple of points I want to talk about just to make sure that people are aware of them. But a lot of them are things that we're just implementing decisions that we long argued and already made. So one example of this is one that that Chris was just discussing, that we did shift to ECDSA P256 and SHA-256 for the algorithms for this. Now, of course, that still does allow RSA for the certificate signature verifications where that is actually required. So in other words, if your CA is like signing your certs with RSA, that is still permitted, but we want the keys that are actually going to be used to generate the signatures that you'll see in these passport objects to be ECDSA. And this is because we still believe there's enough deployment reality of the CAs actually generating the certs themselves with RSA that we cannot reasonably discount that at this time. This was the consensus we had back in Buenos Aires. That has now been implemented and is now in there. As well as a little statement that says we are explicitly following the ES 256 guidance that is in Passport itself, which devolves back to JWT. Hopefully we got that all right. Please do read it, make sure that we're sane. Sean also finally filled in some TBDs. The biggest of those TBDs was the actual ESN.1 module, which had been sitting in Appendix A with an enormous TBD next to it forever. Eyes on that as well for anyone that can hopefully read an ASN.1 module and not have their eyes glaze over or explode. You're welcome to go take a look at Appendix A.
This is Russ. I recompiled it. It works.
It works. Done and done. One interesting thing I'm going to talk about more is we added a level of assurance for certs. This is something we had been talking about for a bit. I will go into what exactly it is that we added in another slide. We tightened the optional OCSP profile. I'll talk a little bit about exactly how we made that profile a little stricter and hopefully got it more interoperable than it has been in previous considerations we've given. And then just like we found everywhere that there were TBDs and either cut them or just integrated them into the main text. So there are a couple of things that were TBDs that we just took the word TBD out from the front. That's like, future people working on this may decide they want to explore this. That's now just part of the main text. Because we've acknowledged, I think, on this from the start that we recognize there's going to be a lot of different environments in the marketplace that are going to be experimenting with this. And we don't want to lock too much down right now. We want to get a kind of minimal baseline out there for how we think search should be used with this, but give a lot of latitude to the deployment community to do what they want with it. And the IANA sections and the references were all cleaned up, and Sean did a great job of all that. But it didn't work me last fall. So speak now, forever hold your peace on this stuff. Next slide. So we've been talking for a long time about having levels of assurance for these instruments, in particular to be able to designate something about the enrollment process and how trustworthy we imagine the certificates would be as a result. I also understand, although I personally do not move in those circles, that there is this NNI task force over at Addis that talks about this, and I understand this shaken proposal there has at least explored some ways of doing LOA for that. So what we kind of wanted to do was to put a stake in the ground in the stir cert spec that would allow LOA in the future, if we decided what we wanted it to mean, that wouldn't require us to really do like a major revision of this in order to get to it. So the compromise we reached from that is that we found a particular existing registry of LOA types, and this is in RFC 6711. And the proposal in the INA considerations of the document now is to create a sub-registry of those LOAs that is specific to STIR. This actually, so it's a SAML registry. that says like you could do this for things other than SAML. And so we're kind of just grafting onto that. Now, the hard part of doing LOAs, and the reason why you don't want to, the reason why we kind of hesitated to specify this too deeply at this time, is because to do LOA properly, you need to have the CP. You need to actually have a certificate profile that tells people the legalese of what the conditions are for determining these levels of assurance. And we're really loath to make that a subject of working group consensus in this room, because that entails all kinds of legalistic things that nobody here really wants to be engaged with.
You meant certificate policy, not profile,
I
right?
said certificate policy.
Okay.
Certificate policy. So what we've done instead is the STIR subregistry requires for each value that you register, you will need to point to the OID of actually the certificate policy. And that just seemed better than defining CPs and CPSs and so on in the context of the working group. Chris.
Chris, this may be a dumb question. I'm not sure. We should have talked about this yesterday. I forgot to talk about it. So is this baked at the certificate level, or is this something, because some of the levels of assurance we've been talking about are sort of per call things rather than associated with a per certificate thing. So
this would be a per certificate thing.
Yeah.
This would be the enrollment procedure that was used to generate the certificate led to.
So you're a class of provider that
Something like that.
has this level of assurance.
Yeah. So this could, so I mean, obviously I personally am interested in like proof of possession certificates, for example. And, you know, a proof of possession certificate will have a different level of assurance to it than something that is being propagated down from like a national regulator, right? And we want to be able to make sure that those look like apples and oranges to relying parties. Now, again, I've looked at what the text was like in Shaken for this, but I haven't looked at it super recently.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think the same things like as a gateway or whatever. I mean, these kinds of things can also be represented by this. But yeah, it would be built into the credential itself rather than just being a circumstantial thing.
So if you don't mind, so an example could be, or could you have the model where, you know, because service providers sometimes would sign on the behalf of customers and things like that, or if they receive a call from some SS7 gateway, they may want to represent that. Would a service provider then have different classes of certificates that they use potentially?
I mean, I think the gateway is a very good example of this.
Yeah.
Where again, their enrollment procedure is very, very different. I mean, I think just informally, of course, I imagine like the highest level of assurance is that your actual service provider who owns the name, right? That you are merely, you know, a customer of and are using for them. Like that's the strongest of these levels of assurance, and the certificate itself should reflect that.
Right.
And then you get into kind of you know, less and less direct forms of association. Like a gateway that would be doing a signature like this might have a certificate that would identify them as a gateway, might, you know, contain some additional information or whatever, but you know, if you're a relying party, you'll be able to ascertain, okay, this came in from like an international SS7 gateway, right? And it got the signature from it, and it's good to know that it came from that gateway because it gives you the accountability you want. Right. You know, so if there was a problem, you can go back and trace it and say, I know the gateway that generated this. And you might treat it as a verification service as you're doing your policy calculation of whether to forward it or block it or maybe send it some kind of special treatment. You could take that into account as you do it.
Yeah, I guess part of it was to pass the quote unquote level of assurance to the receiver, the verifier, to know, you know.
Yes.
How, you know, we're not defining necessarily how you treat the call, but, you know, that might be part of the decision on how you treat the call.
Indeed. Yeah, one factor that they would factor in.
Okay, Martin Dolly. So one of the ideas that we had was, you know, particularly with your mobile device, because it's something you have, and now all the newer phones have a fingerprint reader, so you know it's the identity of the user. And particularly as, you know, for video calling becoming more and more prevalent, actually being able to have some level of assurance of the person that's actually using the device, not just the fact that they could, you know, use that number would be useful to be conveyed, and particularly for the video calling type of use case. But there also may be other examples with banking industry and the like. I know banking, banks have come to AT&T and have, looked at, providing information based on the call coming from a mobile phone, because there is a sense of assurance because it's coming from a mobile phone that it's associated with the person per se.
Yep. Great example. So yeah, what we propose to do is punt on this, right? We've created the barest structure that will allow those LOAs to be filled in as use cases are identified and as people want to create the certificate policies to be associated with those. So it's kind of it's future proofing, allowing that to be out there, and not having to make fundamental changes to the certs in case we decide we need that. So they're relatively cool with that. Anybody hearing this thinking we should not be doing this?
What we said we should do.
All right. So it's what's in there. So we won't rip it out. Next. This is something actually, Russ, you expressed interest in, so I just want to make sure that we get this right. So we do have some OCSP stuff that is built into this, and the way that we imagine this working, we did not see any use for what is the unknown response option in OCSP, and consequently, we have profiled OCSP in such a way that we're asking servers to send not good instead of ever sending unknown. We don't think if the server doesn't know, it's not good. That is the principle that we are operating off of, and at least for our use case, we think it is safe to profile it in that fashion. And so we we make it a should. We stipulate that you should do that for OCSP. And Jan, I haven't seen you this time. How are you? I'm here. And then that clients must treat something that's returned as unknown as not good in this instance. Yes, Ole.
Eric Berger in the chat room says, should send not good unless what? Must send not good, he says, otherwise.
Yeah, I think that is a concession, Eric, to baseline servers for which this would not be OCSP compliant behavior. I mean, that's the problem. We don't want to say that it is impossible to use a baseline OCSP implementation with this, but we can clarify that, Eric. We can put in a line that explains that is why this is only a should. And again, if that was a must, we wouldn't need the next line, right? If it was impossible for the server to send anything to send unknown, then there'd be no need to have client behavior that accommodates it. So I think we want to have the baseline for that allow servers that would handle this normally, and we just have the client thing there as a way of catching it. That's the thinking. Eric. Mr. Berger, is that cool? Is he nodding?
Eric disappeared from the chat room. He said earlier that he was driving in a car over at.
So he's texting in his car.
Jabbering
he's jabbering in his car.
Wonderful.
Yeah. It's better than trying to catch Pokemon, I guess.
He's back, so that's good.
Oh, so Eric, we just wanted to make sure that you're cool with that. Where that is what I just said, and I can say it again.
Eric said, of course, I die right after John answers.
He actually said, yeah, he said, yeah, okay. From the grave.
That's right, from beyond the grave. His final wishes. It was Eric's final wish that we do it this way, and that's how it's going to be done. That's right. Yeah, so let's also note that OCSP responses must be signed with the same ALG as the cert itself. This is a critical property, but that does mean that these OCSP responses can be signed with RSA. Because if that's what the cert is signed by, that's what the OCSP responses have to be signed by. So this is another way that a little bit of RSA still exists in the architecture, but it seemed to be unavoidable, and so we ended up doing that. But I just want to make sure people knew that, and that people were okay with that. We have done our best to rip as much RSA out of this as we can, and just to have DC DSA goodness. I believe that is it. I have another-
Yep.
Yeah, that's it. So again, more eyes on this welcome. But I think we're in pretty good shape for working on last call for this one. This one probably requires the least, I think, changing of, I mean, did we get anything we need to change from this?
Not yet.
Oh, that's true. Yes. Very good, Mary. We'll change that. Mr. Scherner.
You got the floor, Sean.
Hey, so this is just a quick question. Where do we stand on the early quick point assignment request?
Yeah, there was a consensus call on the list about that. Russ?
So this is Russ. I raised that. So far, I've only seen supportive comments. And I was going to ask before we leave today whether anyone wanted to raise any concerns.
Cool.
If there are none in the room, then I will forward it to the ISG and see if they are willing to assign early good points. Alyssa, you knew this was coming.
I think Alyssa can. I believe the new process that Alyssa.
You do it.
Yeah, so Alyssa does
Go
it.
ahead.
She doesn't have to
Don't
go
worry.
to the ISG yet.
Former AD is going to tell us how to do it, right? Sean could write the text and send it to Alyssa.
That sounds like a good plan.
I can take that action item.
Okay.
Thank you, Sean. Real exciting, actually. I'm feeling pretty good about this. We've been working on this obviously for a long time. You know, one thing I would probably start thinking about, since it looks like these are all going to wrap, you know, sometime in the next couple weeks. We know there will be revs for all these, and you know, but at some point we need to have probably some thinking. Is that like this must be a backup slide? I had to refer to it. Yeah. Start thinking about where we want to go from here. And, you know, I think there are a couple of extensions that we think are worth considering. You know, if people really do want to do like diversion and things like that, those are things we could explore here, though obviously other forums are welcome to go after that. But barring that, don't be surprised if when we come to Seoul, I'll be asking for agenda time to discuss something called out of band. Yes, I will request agenda time to discuss it. Our deal was we were going to do in band. We're going to get this where it was. But now we're going to start dealing, again, I'd like to look at least at cases that I think are important cases for actually mitigating the core problems of robocalling that include things, for example, like calls that start in the voice over IP world and end up hitting a gateway to the PSTN, and to look at what strategies are that could allow that initial signature and assurance to become available to smart endpoints that are actually receiving the call itself over the SS7 network. Hybrid architectures like this are unfortunately the main vector of the actual spam that people are receiving, the actual robocalls that people are receiving, and especially the swatting that people are receiving.
Yes.
And so, you know, because of that, I think this is going to turn out to be a crucial use case for us to investigate. And I think I would like to have the opportunity, if there is no other new business and we feel like we're clear with this, to come back and we can look at what we think some of these fallback options would be. And I know Ecker has already done some thinking about this and ways we could do this that'll mitigate some of the privacy risks that might be inherent in it. But again, we don't have any other concerns with in-band. I think we have fulfilled the obligation that we agreed to with the working group, and that we can investigate these other options. Alyssa, would you like to speak to that? Or?
Sure, Alyssa Cooper. I was coming up to suggest maybe good time for a milestone refresh. Out of band is one of the milestones, but there's also some sort of privacy analysis document that is a milestone. Not sure what that is.
I think it was actually related to out of band, because the out of band stuff actually has hard edges on it for that.
Okay. So in any event, it's probably a good time to do that. But yeah, out of band is already one of the milestones. So that seems like the logical next thing to do, unless people have other.
So this is Russ. My view is if we get anything back from the ISG, discusses or comments, that would be the priority. Then we'd move to out of band in terms of time for the slot.
Yeah, fair enough.
I mean, for your timeline, I hope that we are through ISG evaluation before Seoul. There's no reason not to be.
But if there's anything that's surprising, we'll do it then.
Okay, let's try to be done before then.
Okay, that'd be great. And again, I wasn't joking either about there. I think there are probably some useful extensions for us to explore. Just, and some of them may be appropriate for the IETF, some of them may be appropriate for other venues, but I would ask people that are engaged in this work to think about things like that, that we might propose, and that would certainly dovetail into Alyssa's milestone refresh if we need to add some new milestones for things like that.
So just thinking ahead and reacting to Alyssa's, let's see if we can get this into the RSC editor's queue before we get to Seoul. When last call closes, which is in the end of next week, I think, is there anything going on that would prevent a relatively quick spin? And, there's some work. I understand that it'll take some time, but
From either of our, there's three of them, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think Sean is going to have very little work, I think, on this. So that should be simple.
The most busy.
I do want to make sure, and honestly, I think it is Passport that I think has potentially the most material that'll need to be scrutinized for this. And in part that's because, people like Matt Miller are really just looking at this. We just reached out to them as part of last call to make sure that our JDOS usages didn't have problems. And I mean, he pointed out the serialization problem that we wouldn't have caught otherwise, right? So I really do hope that Jim Schad and Matt and people like that are looking at this will get this into shape, so we'll avoid having more work for the ISG when they look at it, and have their reviewers look at it and decide that there's been some major problems. So,
but Chris, you don't have anything coming up like going on to deep, dark, unconnected vacation that would.
I do have vacation, maybe not deep and dark, but no, but I'll try to spin a new version with what we discussed, and then hopefully everybody will have something more final to review.
sure. And just another plug, please come SIP Randy, which we're having on Thursday. So SIP Randy, again, is looking at a STIR profile that is trying to figure out how to do end-to-end confidentiality with the building blocks that we have constructed in STIR. This is something that the administration of the security area of the IETF is very interested in seeing. If we have such a document, I understand that it may assist us in getting more expedient security reviews for a lot of the things that we do in SIP. And so I think it's important that we do it and get it right. And it's actually been interesting because it's led us to a lot of new thinking, or thinking at least I'd never really bothered to do before, of trying to figure out how DTLS SFTP as required in WebRTC would end up interfacing with systems like this. The whole reason we did offer answer in WebRTC in the first place was so that it could be backwards compatible with SIP at some level. And so it'd be great if we actually did the work of figuring out what that gateway and connective tissue looks like to get real security with it. So you can look at that as kind of what the mandate of SIP Randy is. It's using a lot of these same tools. So if you're interested in this, please do come by and take a look. Thanks.
And this is Robert. I will throw in one more plug. If you have an implementation of this, or you expect to have an implementation of this, please join us at the University of New Hampshire in September at the SIPIT. There will be a sizable portion of the multi-party testing at the SIPIT that will focus on this technology. And we hope to have as many folks there as we can. And I believe we're done.
We're done.
Thank you.
Blue sheets, bring them forward, please. Ray doesn't understand what we're doing. The motion he put before the ISC conflicted CSS and the other five. I was like, he doesn't understand at all.
Were you able to get the IOC back on
They shook their head and afraid. Okay. I told them what we were really doing. They were so out of time. They didn't even reword the motion.
Would you do me a
flavor, please?
Would you like to spend those few minutes with me? I talked to him.
Thank you.
And I want to make sure that I got my notes in detail before I respond to them. And she didn't really have a good answer, and Sean's not here. So you're it.
All right. I need to be ready.
Thank you.
What's that? Actually, we got a document from them, and she said, and I said,
So let's find me when you can. Is there anything that?
He didn't act. Soon, I mean, he just didn't send me an act when he was available.
But let me know when and if I can help.
Well,
so this should take more.